Hello and welcome to Worthy Woman Healing. I am Lisa Czak, your host, healing women's minds, bodies, and souls one trigger at a time. On today's episode, I have a very special guest, Dr. Kay Fontana, life force coach and grief recovery specialist. She is going to help us answer a huge question. Does time heal all wounds? And how do you get through? How do you heal from unresolved grief? How do you even know you have unresolved grief, first of all? And how do you heal from it? Stay tuned. We're talking about all things grief today. Don't forget to like, rate, subscribe, review all the things so even more women can heal their minds, bodies, and souls. Here we go. Hello, Kay. I'm so excited to have you on. I was on your podcast and I'm so happy to have you on mine now.
Well, I am excited to be here and thank you so much. It's been a long time since I've seen you, so it's great connecting again.
It hasn't. A lot has changed since I saw you last.
Yes, a lot
And
has changed.
yeah. So I want to dive right in and talk about just why you became a grief specialist. Why? Because grief is kind of like my field that I've pivoted to, right? Healing from abuse, exploitation, trafficking. It's a
Mhm.
heavy subject and it's a multi-layered subject.
Definitely a heavy subject. And
So I'm always curious about the backstory. Let's hear the backstory. Like
sure.
why did you choose this particular field?
Well, it's interesting. I've actually been involved in grief work for 10 years now. And when I was studying to be a licensed spiritual practitioner um, through the Centers for Spiritual Living, I one of the modules that we had to take was on death and dying and grief and loss. And we were invited to read a book, a random book. Well, they had a selection of books that we could choose from. And randomly, I picked the Grief Recovery Method by John W. James and Russell Friedman for my project. And I read it and I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. It was so fascinating and it just hit so many points with me that I really felt like I needed to dig in deeper with it. So what happened is that somebody I knew was a grief recovery specialist and was offering the 8-week grief recovery program, and it was coming up in like a month or so. So I signed up for it. So I started the class, and then meanwhile, my mom was placed in hospice care because she had Alzheimer's. So we put her in hospice care, and I completed the program. I completed the program on Wednesday, and my mom died on Sunday. And that's how, you know, I feel just how spirit works. It's like, okay, you're presented with this class to heal your grief, and then my mom dies. Well, during the class, part of the program, you are working on healing a significant loss. And you go through all the losses in your lifetime, and then you pick one that you want to work on. So I picked my mom because I knew she was ready. She was getting close to dying. And I was also grieving the mom that I used to have because for the last 3 to 5 years, she wasn't the same mom that I had growing up. And so I just felt really connected to this program, and I said I really needed to do more. So I registered for the Grief Recovery Method certification program to be a grief recovery specialist the following year in January. So, and throughout my life, I feel like that death and dying and grief and loss is just ingrained in my DNA because I spent years as an EMT, paramedic,
Mhm.
firefighter. I served on two critical incident stress debriefing teams for emergency services. And I also worked as a volunteer and bereavement coordinator for a hospice agency. And then my doctoral dissertation in 2019 was on mindfulness and compassion among hospice dementia care volunteers.
Wow.
So, and that was inspired by my mom's journey. So, I really felt called to do this. And now, back in 2019, also my dad passed away. And then just most recently, in January of 2023, my husband and soulmate of 40 years passed away. And that was the most devastating loss of all of them. And prior to his death, I stepped away from grief work for a while because of his illness. And I just didn't feel like I
Hmm.
was present enough to help other people. So I stepped away. But then after his death, I had an experience that just really resonated with me and told me I need to get back and do this and help other people because it's so important. It's so important. And it worked for me. It's helped me tremendously. And I know it can help other people too.
I love so many things about what you said because I can totally relate to when your mom is dying and all of a sudden you're presented with this opportunity, like to take this class. For me, it was, remember the healing technique I did on you
Yes,
on your
I,
podcast?
I
I don't
do.
know if I shared that. I actually learned that the week that my mom was dying.
Wow.
I was signed up to get certified in this healing technique called the peace process, the thing that I did on
Right.
you.
Uh-huh.
And like divine timing, right? God provided.
Right.
Because if not for
Exactly.
that, I would have fallen apart during that
Right.
time,
Right.
right? And so I see like this common thread, like in your life, though, like law, like how it, like God just kind of provided these things for you and led you to your calling, right? I love
Exactly.
this. I don't love the fact that you experienced so much loss. I love the fact that you found gratitude in it and a calling in it. And it's going to make you an even more amazing, more empathetic, compassionate grief counselor. I wanted my dad to see you. Remember, I gave
Yes.
because he's struggling because my
Right.
mom died. And he said the same thing, his most devastating loss he's ever experienced.
Exactly.
So anyway, I just really appreciate you sharing your story and how, like, what I really want listeners to hear is that look at all the losses that Kay has had, right? And now how it's led to her calling and
Mhm.
how you took that chunk of time away to take care of yourself, to take care of your husband, to understand like you can't give from an empty cup,
Right.
right? And now
Exactly.
you have like filled your cup up and you're pouring it out to all of us. And I absolutely love that,
Thank you.
right? I absolutely love that. And my dad, obviously, I love my dad, right? To death. And so I think, Dad, could you just call Dr. K? Just call her. Like, just she can help you.
And maybe
We're,
he
we're
will.
working. We're working on it. So anyway, I want to talk about because you have had all of these losses, like how the first major loss was your mom. How long ago was that?
Actually, my first major loss, going back even further, was my brother when I was 9 years old. My brother died of cancer a week after his 17th birthday, and I was 9 years old. And
Oh.
this is another reason why I've been called to do this, because throughout my life, I've realized that, you know, our culture does not recognize or acknowledge or accept death. People avoid it like the plague. And I mean, they avoid talking about it, not death. Yeah. We avoid talking about it, and we also avoid death. But in when I was growing up, I got the impression from my parents that we shouldn't talk about it. We shouldn't talk
Mm.
about Craig because, it would upset mom. And so that was kind of like tucked away for a long time until I realized, going through the grief recovery program, that, yeah, our culture doesn't really acknowledge or want to talk about death. And so we have a tendency of saying inappropriate things to people who are grieving because we
Mhm.
don't know what to say.
Oh
And
my
we've
gosh, I
been
love
taught not
this.
to talk about it.
I
You know,
love this so much because it correlates, it completely coincides with the women I help, right? People
mhm,
don't want to talk about abuse. They don't
right,
want to talk about trafficking, right? They
right.
don't want, they think it's the movie Sounds of Freedom, or shh, we don't talk about that, right?
Yeah.
They don't want to talk about death, like what you're saying, right? This is all like
Mhm,
it's all kind of intertwined. It's like these
right,
taboo subjects, which is why I love having you on, because I love tackling the taboo subjects, the
right,
subjects that nobody else wants to talk about.
right.
And how, what I want to ask you is hearing that message growing up, right? Like, shh, you don't want to upset your mom. Don't
Mhm,
talk about the death.
right.
Don't talk about your brother. Shh, 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 right?
Yeah.
How did that impact you in your adult years dealing with loss?
It's interesting because, I just got that impression from my parents that we just don't talk about it. But then I got into a field of, as a paramedic, and that, people, I was seeing death more often and realizing that people really needed someone to talk to. They really needed
Hmm.
to vent out they needed to vent what they were feeling about, a death in the family. And that also, kind of steered me in the direction of this grief process. And also, in my work and working with the critical incident stress debriefing teams through the emergency services, because that area focused on death of coworkers, like in emergency services.
Hmm.
So police, fire, medical, and when any one of them sustained a loss in their department, then the critical incident stress debriefing team would reach out to them, and then we and meet as a group to address that. And I think that was a point in my life where I really understood how important it was to talk about it, to
Hmm.
get people to express their feelings and emotions about what had happened and not to stuff it. Because I'm telling you, I was in EMS for a while, and it's like you experience something really traumatic and then you just kind of like tuck it away and not talk
Hmm.
about it because you got to go on to the next call. And that's something that first responders deal with all the time, that they take care of the sick and injured, and then they move on to the next thing. So our culture is just ridden with hidden grief. And
Hmm.
it's time that people express it and get it out and heal it. It's so important
Yeah.
because it
I love
leads
that
to
you said that,
emotions.
right? Because you have to feel it to heal it,
Right.
which brings me to, in the introduction, I talked about this, that we're diving into what I consider a myth. I want to hear what you think, that time heals all wounds.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Let's hear it, Dr. K. Let's hear
That
what you have to say
is
about
a
that.
myth. That
All
is
right, we're on the
what.
same page.
Woohoo!
I was
You
like,
know,
this could be risky.
Well, I am so glad you brought that up, because in the grief recovery handbook written by John W. James and Russell Friedman, they address that particular thing. Time heals all wounds. And that's one of the 6 myths that they cover in the book. And, I have known people, in myself included, who have been grieving someone or something for 10, 20, 30, even 40 years, and without ever healing. And they've always been told time heals all wounds. Well, that is not the case, because they, a lot of people are unaware that they're still grieving because they've had this
Hmm.
thing tucked away so deep and for so long that they don't even remember what happened. They don't even
Hmm.
remember the source of their grief. And James and Friedman use an illustration of a backpack. And they say we're all born with this backpack. And every time we experience a loss, we tuck it away in the
Mm,
backpack because we're either taught not to talk about
so
it,
true.
or we are afraid to talk about it, or someone tells us they don't want to hear about it anymore. How many times have you heard, hey, you've been grieving for 2 months now, it's time to move on
Hmm.
now. And that happens so often because people were never trained or taught how to communicate with the grieving. So
Hmm.
they just stuffed away in this backpack. And this backpack gets heavier and heavier as life goes on. And these experiences start when we're children, whether or not you've, grown up in a happy family or an abusive family. Every child experiences a loss of some kind, whether it's a doll, an animal, a
Hmm.
grandparent, or whatever. And those losses just get tucked away. And I kind of think that adults don't think that children grieve that much, that they are resilient and are just not aware. I don't know. I can't explain it, but um
No, that's very true. Because I see it in the women I work with. Oh my gosh, this analogy of the backpack. I feel like they come into my world with this heavy backpack.
right,
And most of them have extra weight on their body on top of that, right? Which is not a
right,
coincidence. And you're
right,
absolutely right. It's that we're literally unpacking everything from that backpack that they've been carrying around with them so
right.
that you can finally be light and free. And just like
Mhm.
there's so many, there was a woman in my healing group just a couple nights ago who was apologizing because she was sobbing in the
Oh,
healing group, right? And she kept
uh-huh.
apologizing. So I dug deeper with her. And she was told as a child, don't cry. What are you crying about? You're a
Right,
kid, like what you just said.
right.
You're a kid. You have nothing to cry about. We assume, like what you were
Mhm.
just saying, kids don't have any worries. What do they have to worry about? They don't have a
Right,
mortgage to pay. They don't have a job to go to.
right.
We completely dismiss children having any kind of stress in their life or like you said, grief or loss. Maybe there was a little butterfly they held in their hand
Mhm.
and it died or something. Like they put
Right.
it down. And that's like this little loss that they carry with them. Right. And then it's like
Exactly.
they set themselves up for, predators coming in and saying, oh, your mom doesn't understand you. Your dad doesn't understand you. I
I
understand
understand
you.
too. Mhm.
It's so,
Right.
oh my gosh, my mind is just going in a million different directions with what you're
Mhm.
saying. This totally resonates with me.
You know,
Absolutely.
you know, when I used to teach in a juvenile detention center. Actually wasn't in the center. The kids were bussed over to my lab in on the Northern Arizona University campus. And the kids in my class generally came from broken homes. So they experienced many facets of grief.
Hmm.
Their parents were in prison, or one had abandoned them when they were young, the many different situations in those kids. Um, and a lot of the kids in the program were involved in gangs.
Hmm.
And now, what is it that these kids are looking for in gangs? Well, they're looking for connection, they're looking for family, and they're looking for belonging, which these gang members provide for them. They give
Hmm.
them a sense of belonging. It's like, hey, come join us because, your family, you don't have a really good family, but we'll take care of you. You'll be, join our family.
Well, it's
And
like sex trafficking, same
yeah,
thing.
exactly. Exactly. And it's so interesting to see the dynamics of these kids that,
Hmm.
growing up and what attracts them. They're just seeking out something that they don't have, something that they're
Hmm.
lacking in their own lives, in their own family. And it leads them down the wrong path. And so, exactly what you were saying,
Yeah, if you
come
don't,
join us. I'll take care of you.
yeah, if you don't, exactly what you're saying too, if you don't get your needs met, you're going to find a different way
Right.
in sometimes very dangerous way to get
Exactly.
you don't even recognize it. And also women, I have women who maybe married abusive men, narcissistic men, right?
Mhm.
And they're like, well, I don't understand, sometimes multiple times. I don't understand why I keep choosing this same type of
Same kind
man.
of guy, right?
And it's because it goes back to like that's what their brain is familiar with, right?
Hmm.
If they were invalidated and dismissed as a child, they're most likely going to choose a partner that
Hmm.
invalidates them and dismisses it because it feels healthy. It feels normal, even though it's
Feels
not
normal,
healthy.
right? Exactly.
Yeah. Or
And
they
even if
set
it
them,
wasn't their family, it was like the first person that they fell in love with that turned
yeah.
out to be like that. And then, that just set the pattern for the rest of their lives,
Or a
connecting.
boss, right?
Right,
Like they have a
right,
boss that treats them that way. Why do I keep getting these bosses like this? What's
right.
going on?
Uh-huh.
So that must have been fascinating work actually that you did, just seeing heartbreaking too,
Yeah.
but you see it from a different angle. Like I feel like what we're saying to people is really, even if you think to yourself, no, I've never really lost anyone like super close yet, right?
Mhm.
I've never really experienced loss. You have, you just don't realize it.
Right.
And so
But
that's like unresolved grief. Like, how do you even know if you have unresolved grief? Tell our
yeah.
listeners out there that maybe they are saying, I don't know, I've never experienced loss, but I just feel like I'm attracting the wrong people, or there's just this hole inside, these needs that aren't being met.
Hmm.
So, how do they know if they're experiencing unresolved grief?
Well, unresolved grief is not only cumulative, but it's cumulatively negative. And, this goes back to losses from years ago when it was never healed. And as we go through life, as I mentioned, we keep tucking these losses away. I thought about when I was meeting with a client a few months ago, and we were going through the grief program. And all of a sudden, I realized something that I hadn't thought about in probably, let me see, well, I don't want to divulge my age, but it was probably probably 60 years. so, um, so when I was a child, when I was like 3 or 4 years old, I had this doll. And I remember this doll. It was like my favorite doll. It was called Baby Move. I tried to look it up on the internet. I couldn't find it, but maybe that was just the nickname I gave it. I don't know. So, but apparently my parents saw something on the news about Baby Move, and that it turned out to be flammable. It was made out of flammable plastic that would catch on fire if exposed to heat. And so they were instructed to take their, if your child has this doll, bring it to the fire department so that they can take care of it or destroy it or
Hmm.
whatever. So that's what my parents did. We took off to the fire department, handed over my doll, and that was it. It was like I was devastated. That was my favorite doll. And then my mom, bless her heart, bought me another doll to replace it, which we don't want to do. We don't want to replace the loss. And 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 I hated the doll because it wasn't my Baby Move. I didn't like it. It was almost scary. It was like a scary doll. It wasn't intended to
Hmm.
be a scary doll. But you know, in the process, in the grief recovery program, we look at all losses. We do a loss history graph and invite people to think back from the very first memory they have as a child and to the present day moment and think about all the different
Hmm.
losses that they've had in their life. Now, according to the grief recovery method or the grief recovery institute, there are over 40 different types of losses. So we are only focused on primarily on death,
Hmm.
divorce, estrangement or abandonment or anything that involves people.
Hmm.
But those 40 different types of losses include a lost doll, a lost dog or pet. They lost they include moving to another town,
That's a big
lots
one. Yeah.
lots of finances. When you move, you
Yeah.
lose all your friends,
Hmm.
and your connections at home. It could be a loss of life once lived. Perhaps at one time, for me and my husband, we used to
Hmm.
go out and do things. We'd go boating and fishing and camping and all these things. Then when he started getting sick, then we couldn't do those things anymore. So our life was really limited. So I kind of grieved the loss of the life that we used to have. um Anyone that's experiencing health issues, they can't do the things that they used to do. Maybe a loss of career.
Hmm.
Somebody gets downsized, in their
Hmm.
company that they've been with for
Yeah.
20, 30 years, and all of a sudden it's like you're either too old, or we're downsizing and we're
Hmm.
changing, and so you've got to go.
Oh my
So,
gosh, that's so true. Like my husband just went through that. He got fired
really,
for the first time,
oh my
and it
gosh,
was a grief process. Like he didn't even
exactly.
understand what he was going through, but
Hmm.
it was absolutely like I was like, you're grieving. I saw him
Yeah,
go through like all of these
yeah,
stages.
exactly.
And we had a friend that went through. I was like, wow. And what about a loss of self too? I hear that a lot with the women I work with. I feel like
Absolutely.
I've lost myself. Like I'm
Right.
not myself. I'm a shell of a
Exactly.
person. These are the
Right.
kinds of things that I hear, right?
This is how I used to be, and now I just don't feel connected to myself. I don't feel like I know my purpose. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, why I'm here. And people can also grieve their, loss of faith, loss of
Mm-hmm.
trust. The women that you deal with,
Mm-hmm.
they're experiencing probably a lot of loss of trust. They don't
Oh
trust
yeah.
people, and it's like, who can I trust? I don't know. But that whole self identity, and
Mm-hmm.
the faith, people blame God for their
Oh
mishap
yeah.
in life.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're, especially when they experience those losses over and over again, then it starts to look like, God's picking on me, or, something. What did I do wrong to deserve all of this? And so they lose
Yeah.
faith in God. And um,
So
so,
you said something
oh,
I want to touch on.
sure.
I thought was really interesting about your doll story. You said
Mhm.
you can't replace a loss. Can you
Right.
expand on that?
That's one of the myths of that James and Friedman talk about, the six myths, and one of them is replacing the loss. There's this idea that the statements that people make when people are grieving, their husband died. It's like, well, at least you're young enough to remarry or find someone else. They lose a child, at least you're young enough to have another child. Or your dog dies, and well, there, you can get another dog. So there's this idea that that people impose on people who are grieving, that if they replace the loss, everything's going to be okay. And that's
Right.
just one of those myths. And, it's kind of like, don't feel bad. It's like, well, why should I feel bad?
Don't cry. Yeah.
Yeah. Or
And
grieving
yeah.
alone.
And you're also invalidating their experience when you do that. You're dismissing their
Exactly.
experience when they do that, when you do that.
Exactly.
And it's almost like you're making that person or whatever it is that they lost indisposable, right? It's
Right.
like, you can just get another one. Just get
Yeah. You can
another
get
one.
another one.
Or, well, I
Yeah.
always say anytime you say the words, at least you're
At least.
lowering your standards,
Exactly.
right? Whether someone's
Exactly.
saying it to you or you hear yourself saying it, you're
Yeah.
lowering your standards, or like you said, you're brushing it under the rug. Like
Right.
even if you're telling yourself that, well, at least I can get another dog, or at least I
Yeah.
can get another fill in the blank.
Right.
You're dismissing your own experience. You're kind of
Right.
brushing it under the rug and keeping it in the backpack, right? That
Hmm.
backpack that's on you,
Exactly.
you're just keeping it on there. And it also explains why a lot of women go from like an abusive relationship, right? to
Mhm.
another abusive relationship. They just
Right.
replaced that loss.
Right. Exactly. Because that's what they're used to.
Hmm.
Exactly. And it's funny because with that doll story, I hadn't thought about it in years. Seriously.
Hmm.
Like, since I was a child, I hadn't even thought about that. But my mom's intentions were good. She thought that if she got me another doll,
Right.
that I would be okay with it. But I wasn't. And I had more um, frustration over it because, she gives me a doll that I didn't want and I didn't like, and thinking that it was going to be okay. I would feel better if I had another doll, which I didn't.
Ooh, wait,
But
what you just said is key. Your mom in that moment, I think a lot of us do this, or people
uh-huh.
do it to us. They're uncomfortable with how painful we feel, the
Right,
hurt that we feel. They just want to
right.
make it go away, or we just want to make it
Exactly.
go away.
Hmm.
So it's like, here, just do this. So instead of just feeling your way through it, right?
Hmm. Right.
Instead of just allowing you to cry and grieve the loss of that doll, it's like, no, no, no. You know, it's like we're uncomfortable with other people's pain.
Exactly. And that's the whole core of the myths of grief, is that we're not taught in school. This should be taught in school.
Oh,
And I would think
absolutely.
that if
Uh-huh.
if grief, was taught in school, then we wouldn't have people that are suffering so much and later in life, and
Or
you know
they'd know what to say
they would know what to say and
or
not make.
not say.
Right. And matter of fact, that was the subject of my podcast last week, was on what not to say, words that hurt and words that heal.
Wait,
And
what is your podcast now? What's the name of your podcast now?
it's Healing Our Grieving Hearts podcast. And you can see
Okay.
it on, you can find it on any podcast platform. So, but it's funny that you should mention that, because that's exactly what I covered in my podcast last week. It's like,
Wow.
say
That's a
so
great
many
resource.
things. And also, I also mentioned the phrase "at least." I said, if you ever catch yourself saying "at least,"
You're
then
like,
stop right there
I know it's like,
and
stop.
go no further.
You are only as sick as your secrets. It is time to stop suffering in silence and join other women who are also on a healing journey, who are being raw, real, vulnerable, and honest with what they are going through in their life, what they have been through in their life. And wherever two or more are gathered, we know God is with us. It says it right there in the Bible. So there is power to group healing. Miracles happen in there. You have one woman sharing, opening up her heart. Suddenly, everyone else in the group is saying, yeah, I've experienced that. I'm not the only one. There's such power in knowing that you are not alone in your suffering. You are not alone in your healing. And we meet twice a month. And in between those times, a lot happens, right? And it's important that you have time in between the sessions to practice the healing technique that I teach you, so you can come back into the group and celebrate with the other women. Hey, I actually remembered to do the healing technique in that moment. That trigger didn't derail me anymore. But it's practice. I'm also a personal trainer, right? You don't just get a six-pack abs by doing one sit-up. You have to keep doing it over and over again. You don't run a marathon. You don't go out and run 13.1 miles for a half marathon the first time, right? You practice running a little bit every day. And that is what we do in Worthy Woman Healing Group. Join today and tell yourself, I'm going to give this a 3-month commitment minimum, because I know I need time to practice outside of these sessions, and come in and get guidance from the other women on how to actually heal all of these wounds, heal my mind, body, and soul one trigger at a time. You are worth it. You're lowering the standard. You're lowering the standard for everyone. Well, that's great that you have a podcast. I'll have Steve put it up there, and I'm going to definitely check it. I'm going to make sure my dad is guided to that podcast
Absolutely.
so that he can get to know you, kind of see you,
Perfect.
I love what you just said too about how it's not taught in schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask, I bet if you and I went on the street right now, right? And we
Uh-huh.
just asked random people, have you ever experienced grief? A lot
Right.
of people would be like, no one super close to me has died.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
Right.
Like they don't like that whole list that you gave.
Mm-hmm.
If more people understood that that's grief and what they're feeling is
Right.
normal and just to feel their way through, allow themselves to really feel it,
Yeah.
right? I
Exactly.
think that, yeah, people would show up a lot different in their life
And
and for other people.
it's funny because I was at I had a table at a wellness expo recently. Well, actually it's been a few months, but people would come up to my table and I share, what I did, and they go the same thing. Well, I don't think I've really
Grief.
experienced any grief, but it's funny because I had a woman in one of my grief groups that we were doing this activity, going back to your original question about how do you know if you have grief? It's like, well, 100% of us are grieving. There is no doubt about
Wait,
it.
say that again. If you don't get
100
anything else out of this,
Yes.
listen to Dr. K.
100% of us are grieving. Everybody is grieving something, whether they recognize it or not. And
I
the
love that.
during the grief recovery program, then, as I mentioned, we go through a lost history graph, looking at every single thing in our life that was negative that we might have experienced grief. And I had a woman in my class a few years ago that in the middle of the program, she goes, "Oh my gosh, I just remembered something. I remembered my aunt that died when I was 6 years old, and I was devastated, but we never talked about it after that. And so
See?
I had
Yeah.
completely forgotten about it." She actually forgot about her aunt dying, or her great aunt or something like that. But that happened, well over 50 years ago. And
Mhm.
she had just remembered it. So,
I love that because it's also traumas like that too. People will say to me, how do I know if I have trauma? I said,
uh-huh,
if you're breathing and walking around the world and living and a human being, you have
yeah,
trauma.
you have trauma.
100% of us have
Yeah,
trauma. It's on a continuum, right?
right,
What was
right.
traumatic for me might not have affected you at all, and vice versa.
Mhm.
Everyone has trauma.
Exactly.
And trauma and grief, I almost feel like trauma and grief are kind of the same thing in a lot of
Yes.
ways,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Because you grieve, trauma. Trauma results in some level of grief, whether it is, depending on what type of trauma it is. The trauma could be, abandonment in childhood.
Mhm.
It could be the abuse. It could be, our soldiers overseas, they're certainly experiencing grief, because they experience trauma all the time. And
Mhm.
my heart just goes out to them being in some foreign country and dealing with all this stuff, and, and seeing their comrades, and, you know, being hurt or injured or, dying. I, my heart goes out to them. But yeah,
Mhm.
you're right. Everyone experiences trauma.
Everyone.
Hmm.
So here's the question though.
Hmm.
So we now know time does not heal anything, right? So how
Right.
do you heal from grief? There's a question for you, Dr.
Oh,
K.
that's a good one. Well, the way to heal from grief is not to skate around it, but to walk through it.
Ouch. That sounds like
Ouch.
it's gonna hurt.
Yeah.
That
And
sounds
it
super
will.
painful.
It will. But in the grief program, um, we focus on the losses, and then picking one significant loss that probably is one that is the most painful, or one that they feel has impacted their lives the most. It could have been a relationship, it could be a family member, it could be
Man, just one. I'm
yeah.
thinking I got a list a mile high.
Right. But the beauty part of this, Lisa, is that once you go through the program, you have the tools to go through that list and do more. And you don't
Oh.
have to go through the class or the program every
Mhm.
time you want to heal a loss. You excuse me, my throat's dry.
Did you need to
You
get some
can take,
water?
you can use the tools to do it again, and
On your own?
on your own.
So the first round, you are taking people who have a significant loss, whatever loss they want to work on, and they're working on it with you alone in a
Mhm.
class. What's happening? How are they
either
doing it?
either individual or a group, and we work through the program. We do take a series of action steps to address that loss and to heal that loss. Once they're done, they have the tools to go back and do it again on their own.
And how long, what's the length of time?
For individuals, it's 7 weeks, and for a group, it's 8 weeks, because when a
Oh,
group, there's more discussion.
mhm.
So it takes
Look
a
at
little bit
that.
longer.
And would you say that people that go in for a significant loss, right? Whatever that might be, that's significantly impacting them. In 7 weeks, how will they know if they are healed from this loss?
That's a really good question. I have not ever had anyone come to me and say it didn't work. So I am very confident that because of the action steps that are taken, that they can heal that loss. And if there's something that's missing that they forgot about, because it all is about forgiveness statements, apologies, and significant emotional statements. Like, what you did 10 years ago that really hurt me and affected me, and I felt invalidated. But I forgive you for I forgive you for the choice that you made.
And just to be clear, they're not saying this to the person that harmed them or hurt them. They're simply saying this for themselves. Is that right?
Exactly. So if the person is living
Mm-hmm.
and it was a strained relationship, they are not saying these things to that person. It's all about healing themselves and about
Mm-hmm.
delivering undelivered communication to that person, or even that thing, or the pet. So they're delivering that communication that was
Mm-hmm.
unspoken during the time of
Yeah.
the relationship, but they're not
And
saying it was okay. They're just saying, for themselves, I apologize for what I did, or I forgive you for what you did.
I love that. I love that you stated that, right? Because the forgiveness piece can be very hard. And I think it's hardest to forgive ourselves too, even
Right.
if we were a victim, right? Even if
Exactly.
we were victimized, like a lot of the women I work with, they've been manipulated and coerced and brainwashed into believing that they were a willing participant,
Right.
that they chose this, right? A lot of grooming went on. And so it's a lot of self-forgiveness, right? It's almost like it's easier for them to forgive the monster that trafficked them or abused them in
Hmm.
their mind. Like these are words that they will use with me,
Right.
but yet they hold on to that piece of, but maybe it was my fault. Maybe I did do something
Hmm.
to, they just all this forgiveness, like the self-forgiveness is the hardest thing. What
Right.
tip do you have for, I know we're totally going off like what we were going to talk about, which is
That's okay.
normal.
That's
We did
okay.
this in our other podcast
I
too.
know.
But
That's
like
fine.
seriously, what tip would you give that woman that's out there that is just holding on to this sort of blame or just not able to forgive herself. She forgives everyone else freely,
Right,
right? But
right.
she just can't seem to forgive herself. What tip would you give her? What
Oh,
would you want to say to her?
I would want to say that, that speaking that out and getting that out in the open and really looking at that relationship, that, you know, to forgive yourself is, what you're saying is, in forgiveness, you're not saying that what happened was okay, that that you're not a willing participant in this, that what they did to them is not okay, but you're forgiving yourself so that you can move on. And,
Mm-hmm.
we don't look at the past and we don't look at the future because we can't do anything about it. We can't change the past. We can't predict or determine our future. All we can do is right now, and
Mm-hmm.
to be in the now, and to forgive ourselves for whatever happened in our lives, because
Mm-hmm.
we can't change it and it doesn't matter
No,
anymore because it's gone. It's past, it's done. And all
but
we
yet,
can do is focus on ourselves right now and have that self-compassion for
mhm.
ourselves, that so that we can move forward.
So, and yet what I see a lot, maybe you see this a lot with your clients. I know I say I'm a recovering ruminator,
Yes.
right? So even though it's in the
Right.
past, right?
Hmm.
I ruminate in my head. Like I just have this tendency to do that. That's just who like the way it's been the biggest challenge in my life. Like even
Yes.
stupid things, right? Whatever, like
Right.
something that's non-traumatic or whatever, just something, a conversation I had where I'm just like ruminating in my head. Do you have
Exactly.
any tips for getting out of that rumination? Replaying over and over again in your mind what happened to you or what was said to you or what you said, whatever it is that you can't, that continuous loop that's going on
Yes.
over and over
Right.
again.
So I think it all begins with gratitude. And gratitude is such an amazing tool. And gratitude refocuses our attention on things in our life that are good. And in
Mm-hmm.
order for us to receive good and get more good in our life, then we have to recognize it, that it's out there. And so recognizing, having gratitude for, starting small, maybe one thing. Tonight, I am so grateful that I'm alive. I am
Mm-hmm.
so grateful that that I have straight hair. It's like, not really, because I love your
I'll
hair.
trade you. I want your hair.
But just having gratitude that I have
Mm-hmm.
a roof over my head. I have, I had dinner tonight. I had
So true.
whatever it is. But gratitude is such a huge thing for healing. And by continuously building on that gratitude, then that other stuff starts to fall away. Because
That
right
is so,
now,
that's a clue about healing too, right?
yeah,
Like
right.
I had a woman in my last group that she said to me, you know, I am celebrating that all of the struggles I went through, every single mental and emotional breakdown I had the past year. Like
Mhm.
that's gratitude, right?
Right, right.
And that's healing. It's this question. I get this, how do you know you're healed, right?
Uh-huh.
These are all clues that you are I think healing is a
Right,
journey. I'm not sure it's a destination.
right. It is a journey. It is a journey. And obviously it's a journey because we don't know when healing should end, but um because there's no time limit on healing. No time limit. It can take somebody 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. we don't know, but it is a journey. So it isn't a destination
Mhm.
because we can't put our finger on when that day that
Mhm.
we're going to be healed.
I
So
just
yeah,
think life is one big healing journey,
it
because
is.
it snowballs, right? Okay,
Right.
so you're gaining some traction healing with one loss, right? And then
Uh-huh.
another loss comes along, another, it's like into the snowball effect.
Yes.
But I love the fact that if you have tools in place, right?
Hmm.
You don't have to be afraid
Goodness.
of it anymore. It's like,
Right.
okay, I can handle this. I know what to do. I have resources. I'm not alone. That's a big thing, right?
Right. And another thing I want to mention about about healing and loss and grief and is that there are many gifts in our trauma.
I say that all the
And
time.
we
Triggers are
have
gifts.
right, we have to look at it. What is the gift in this?
Mhm.
What am I to learn? Or what am I supposed to know about what happened to me? You
I
know?
love that. I say that all the time. I say triggers are gifts. They're not wrapped up in shiny packages with pretty
Right.
bows on top. You won't
Right.
recognize it as a gift unless
Exactly.
you start being aware, like what you just said.
Mhm.
When you can find gratitude in every and all circumstances, your life
Mhm.
really does change. Because
It,
all we're really doing, right, is adding to our misery, right? You
mhm.
have this like major loss, whatever that might be, and then on top of it, like maybe you're beating yourself up, or you're
Right.
not forgiving yourself, or you're
Right.
holding on to resentment, anger, blah blah blah. It's just
Right.
making it worse. All we're
Right.
doing is we're pouring salt on our own wounds.
Mhm.
And then you've got the outside world who they don't know how to handle grief or trauma, right?
Mhm.
And so they're saying things that make it even worse.
Right.
But like if
Exactly.
I love this program that you have, because if you can become aware of that, right? It's
Right.
like you expect that people are going to say that, not because they're mean
Right.
or because they don't care about you or don't love you. They don't know.
They don't
People, you
know.
don't know what you don't know.
That's right.
And
And
so when
that's
you can look at it
because
like
people
that,
are
it's like, okay,
searching. They're like
yeah.
scrambling, like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say to this person? And, the best thing that people can say to someone who is grieving is, you know, I can't imagine how you're feeling right now. Because grieving people don't want to be healed, they want to be heard. They want to
That gave me
express.
chills.
Right. They just want to be heard. They want somebody to acknowledge their grief and not try to put a band-aid on it because you can't put a band-aid on it. But you can be there
Hmm.
in your presence and just listening. And that's
Hmm.
really all that people want when they're grieving is somebody to listen to them and tell their story. And that's it, you
I feel
know.
like that was like a mic drop. That's the whole purpose of my podcast, is to give women a safe place to share their story,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
they haven't been able to tell anyone. And then that's like the springboard to be able to do it, just like in their life.
Yeah.
So I absolutely love that. I feel like we can wrap up with what you just said just now, and is there anything else? So there's that woman, I focus on women because that's who I work
Yeah.
with. But there's that woman who feels like she is drowning in her grief right now, whatever that grief might be. We just gave a
Yeah.
whole list, and
Right.
maybe she's listening to this and for the first time realizing, oh, that's why I feel as bad as I do.
Right, exactly.
Now I
Because her
understand.
backpack is overloaded and it's
So
about
what
ready
is
to
the
fall
first
off.
step she can take to lighten that backpack? What's the very first step you would tell her to take?
The first step, I would highly recommend going through one of these programs, whether it's me or somebody else, but
Let's
just
focus on you. What
having
is your program? Tell her.
well, my program it's through the Grief Recovery Institute and it's the Grief Recovery Methods Support Group program. I offer it online, also in person in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And it can be done individually or in a group. And I also am a life force coach. And so I focus on energy healing. And because I
Mm,
believe that we can that our energy systems can get blocked by our trauma, by our grief. And energy, opening up those energy channels is a way of releasing and reconnecting our energy systems so that we can move forward and we can heal our grief. So there's a lot to be said about
Mhm.
energy healing and grief, but I also do the grief recovery program. Now the grief recovery program is for adults, but I also offer a pet loss program and also
Mhm.
helping children with loss.
I
Because
love
as I
that.
mentioned, that children are kind of, brushed aside. They think that they're resilient and that they really need, especially with all the things that they hear about trauma in schools,
Mhm.
school shootings and, suicides and things like that, that these kids don't understand and really don't have a mechanism of dealing with it. And sometimes teachers and parents just don't know how to address
Mhm.
their grief either. So I think it's really important that these kids get that attention too.
So it sounds like the first step is really recognizing that you don't have to do this alone,
Right,
that there
exactly.
are resources and help out there. And we'll make sure that we put all that in show notes. So anyone that wants to reach out to you, that is
Perfect.
struggling, just know that you're not alone. That's
Right,
amazing. You don't
right.
have to suffer in silence anymore.
Right. And there's people
Mhm.
out there that want to help you, want to hear your story in a safe
Mhm.
place and help you move forward.
I love that. All right, Kay. Well, thank you so much for being on. I really, really appreciate all
Thank
the
you.
wisdom and education and prevention also that women are going to get just from maybe they don't have to go through all of the, feeling alone and all of that. Like,
Right.
oh, there's
Exactly.
help.
Right.
So I
Exactly.
can't thank you enough for what you do and for listening to your calling. That's huge.
Yes. Thank you.
Right. All of your experiences led to us being on this podcast and you're helping others. Like you filled up your own cup and the overflow is going to all these other people. And I absolutely admire you for that. So
Yeah. Thank you.
thank you so much.
And
All
if
right.
they need
And
any information, if they want more information about me, they can go to healingourgrievinghearts.com and you'll find recordings of my previous podcasts and find out more about the grief recovery program. And there's also um, a little booklet that they can download about grief,
oh,
and
nice. Okay, I
free
love that.
booklet on there. So, but thank you
Okay.
so much for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. And it's so good to see you again,
It's
Lisa.
so good to see you too.